She thought she was saving a dying hunter from the frozen hell of a winter blizzard. But the man bleeding out in the back of her supply wagon was the one person who could start a war between two worlds. And by the time she discovered who he really was, it would already be too late to turn back. The blizzard hit Copper Ridge like the fist of an angry god. Thea Lockhart had seen bad winters before. Growing up in the Montana Territory taught you to respect the cold, to read the sky like a book written in shades of gray and white. But this storm was different. This was the kind of weather that buried entire mining camps, that turned men into frozen statues still clutching their pickaxes. The wind howled through the mountain pass with a voice that sounded almost human, almost pleading, and the snow fell so thick you couldn't see your own hand stretched out in front of your face. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour, and the clouds hung so low they seemed to press down on the earth itself, suffocating everything beneath their grey weight. She should have stayed in Silver Pine. Should have listened to old Dutch McCready when he'd warned her at the general store that morning. His weathered face creased with concern as he'd watched her load supplies onto her wagon. He'd grabbed her arm with his gnarled fingers, strong despite his 70-odd years, and told her in no uncertain terms that this storm was going to be a killer. But Thea had a contract to fulfill, supplies to deliver to the lumber camp 15 miles north, and she'd never missed a delivery in 3 years of running her wagon route. Her father had built this business from nothing, had spent 20 years earning the trust of every mining camp, lumber operation, and trading post within a 50-mile radius. After he died last spring, coughing up blood in his bed, while the doctor stood helpless beside him, she'd made a promise over his grave. She would keep the business running. She would honor his reputation. She'd be damned if she let it fall apart on her watch. The wagon lurched over another hidden rock, and Thea gripped the reins tighter, her fingers numb even through her leather gloves. Her 2 draft horses, Brandy and Whiskey, were struggling badly now. She could see it in the way their heads hung low, in the labored clouds of steam that puffed from their nostrils with every breath. Their coats were thick with ice, and their legs were starting to shake from the effort of pulling the heavy wagon through snow that had drifted in places to nearly 3 feet deep. They were strong animals, Belgian drafts built for hard work in rough country, the kind of horses that could pull a loaded wagon up a mountain pass without breaking stride. But even they had limits, and Thea knew they were approaching those limits fast. "Just a little further," she called to them, though her voice was snatched away by the wind almost before it left her lips. "We'll find shelter soon, I promise. Just keep moving, girls. Keep moving." It was a lie, and she knew it. There was nothing out here but wilderness and snow, and the ghosts of men who'd made the mistake of underestimating this country. The lumber camp was still hours away, assuming they were even still on the right trail. The landmarks she usually relied on had vanished beneath the white blanket that covered everything in sight. The old lightning-struck pine that marked the turn-off to Sawyer's Creek was invisible. The cairn of stones that the trappers had built to mark the halfway point was buried. The road itself was barely visible, just a slight depression in the endless white that could just as easily be a dried creek bed or a game trail. She was navigating by instinct now, by the feel of the land beneath the wagon wheels and the vague memory of having traveled this route dozens of times before. Every rock, every dip, every rise should have been familiar, but the storm had transformed the landscape into something alien and hostile. Thea's father had taught her to read the land the way some people read books. He'd taken her on her first supply run when she was 8 years old, a little girl with pigtails and a dress that was always getting dirty. She'd sat beside him on the wagon seat, watching how he handled the reins, listening to him explain why he took this route instead of that one, how to tell good water from bad, which trails were safe in spring but deadly in winter. By the time she was 16, she could navigate the territory as well as any man, and by 20, she was making runs on her own when her father's health started failing. Those last few months before he died, he'd ridden beside her sometimes, too weak to handle the reins himself, but determined to keep teaching her everything he knew. "This land will test you," he told her one cold morning as they'd watched the sun rise over the Bitterroot Range. "It'll take everything you've got and ask for more. But if you respect it, if you learn to read its moods and understand its rules, it'll take care of you too." She wondered what he'd say if he could see her now, alone in a blizzard that was rapidly becoming the worst she'd ever experienced, risking her life and her horses' lives for a delivery that probably wouldn't even be appreciated. The foreman at the lumber camp was a mean son of a gun named Jessup Crane, who always tried to short her on payment and complained about the quality of goods, even when everything was exactly as ordered. But a contract was a contract, and the Lockhart name meant something. It meant reliability. It meant honor. It meant your word was your bond, and once given, it couldn't be broken. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought it was just another snow-covered boulder, a dark shape hunched beside what might have been the remnants of a trail marker or an old fence post. The storm created shadows and shapes that weren't really there, tricks of the failing light and swirling snow that could make you see things that didn't exist. But then the shape moved, just slightly, a subtle shift that was too deliberate to be caused by wind or falling snow. Thea's heart kicked hard against her ribs, sudden adrenaline cutting through the cold-induced fog in her brain. She pulled back on the reins hard, and the horses stopped immediately, grateful for the reprieve. They stood with their heads down, flanks heaving, steam rising from their backs in thick clouds that were torn apart by the wind as soon as they formed. "Hello?" she shouted, her voice raw from breathing cold air. She wrapped the reins around the brake handle with stiff fingers and climbed down from the driver's seat, her movements awkward and clumsy. Her boots sank into snow that came up past her knees, and the cold bit through her wool trousers like they were made of paper. "Can you hear me?" "I'm coming to help you." The figure didn't respond. As Thea struggled through the drift toward it, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to push her back toward the wagon, she could make out more details. It was a man, definitely a man, and he was in bad shape. He wore what looked like buckskin and furs, traditional clothing that might have kept him warm under normal circumstances, but was now soaked through and frozen stiff. He was on his side, curled into himself in the instinctive position of someone trying to conserve what little warmth remained in his body. Long dark hair, loose and matted with ice and snow, partially obscured his face. One arm was tucked against his chest, the other stretched out as if he'd been reaching for something before he collapsed. And there was blood. Even against the white snow, even in the dim grey light of the storm, she could see the blood. Dark patches that had melted through the snow around him, creating shallow depressions that were already starting to fill in with fresh powder. "Oh, God," Thea breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. The snow soaked through her trousers immediately, an icy wetness that made her gasp. She pulled off one glove, tucking it under her arm, and pressed her bare fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. His skin was so cold it barely felt human, more like touching marble than flesh. For a long moment, she felt nothing but that terrible coldness, and her stomach dropped like a stone. She'd come too late. He was already dead. But then, just as she was about to pull her hand away, she felt it. Faint and thready and irregular, but unmistakably there. A pulse. He was alive. She shook his shoulder, not gently. There was no time for gentle. Hey, can you hear me? You need to wake up. I can't carry you if you don't help me." His eyelids fluttered and she caught a glimpse of dark eyes before they closed again. They were disoriented, unfocused, the eyes of someone who was too far gone to really understand what was happening. His lips moved, cracked and bleeding, forming words she couldn't hear over the roar of the wind. She leaned closer, turning her ear toward his mouth. So close, she could feel the faint warmth of his breath against her skin. "Ambush," he whispered, the word barely more than a breath, forced out with obvious effort. Each syllable seemed to cost him something. "They came from the ridge. Arrows, so many arrows." Thea pulled back, her heart suddenly racing for a different reason. She scanned the area around them with new urgency, her hand instinctively moving toward the rifle strapped across her back. She saw what she'd missed before in her focus on the man, the signs of violence scattered across the snow like evidence of some terrible crime. Broken arrows, their shafts snapped and half-buried in the drifts, the fletching torn and ragged. Dark stains that could only be blood, leading off into the trees in a trail that suggested someone or something had been dragged away. Disturbed snow that spoke of a struggle, of multiple people moving quickly and violently. And there, maybe 20 feet away, partially covered by the drifting snow that was rapidly burying all evidence of what had happened here, the body of a horse. It was a paint, brown and white, lying on its side with its legs frozen in a running position. An arrow still protruded from its neck, the shaft buried so deep only the fletching was visible. Her hand went to her rifle, actually drew it this time, and she worked the lever action to chamber a round. The metallic sound was loud even over the wind. She swept the area with her eyes, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that whoever had done this was still around. But there was nothing. Just snow and wind and the growing darkness as the storm clouds made evening come early. Whoever had ambushed this man was long gone. They'd have to be insane to stay out in this storm, to wait in freezing conditions on the chance that their victim might still be alive. Then again, Thea thought grimly, they'd have to be pretty desperate or pretty angry to ambush someone in weather like this in the first place. This wasn't a random attack. This was deliberate. Someone had tracked this man, had waited for the right moment, and had struck with overwhelming force. "Who did this to you?" she asked. But the man had lost consciousness again. His breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a visible struggle. She could see now where most of the blood was coming from. There was a deep gash across his ribs on the left side, a wound that had sliced through his buckskin shirt and the skin beneath. The edges of the wound were ragged, suggesting a blade rather than an arrow, and it was still bleeding sluggishly, despite the cold that should have helped slow the flow. He'd also taken a serious blow to the head. There was a nasty cut above his right eye, and the swelling around it was grotesque, distorting his features. The bone beneath might be fractured. She'd seen enough injuries growing up in frontier country to recognize the signs. This man needed a doctor, needed proper medical care in a warm building with clean supplies and someone who actually knew what they were doing. What he was going to get instead was her, a woman with basic field medicine skills and a bag of supplies meant for treating horses as much as people. Thea had exactly two choices, and she knew she had to make the decision fast. Every minute she stood here was a minute colder, a minute closer to the storm, becoming completely unsurvivable. She could leave him here and save herself, turn the wagon around and make a run for Silverpine, hope she could retrace her path before the snow covered her tracks completely. He was a stranger, and out here most strangers meant trouble one way or another. She didn't know him, didn't know his story, didn't know if he was a good man or a bad one. And if she was being completely honest with herself, there was another consideration too. He was Native American. That much was obvious from his clothing and his features and the way he wore his hair. Relations between the settlers and the local tribes had been tense for months now. Ever since the territorial governor had started making noise about relocating the reservations to open up more land for mining and logging. There'd been incidents, angry confrontations that occasionally turned violent. The newspapers in Helena were full of editorials calling for military intervention, while others demanded peaceful negotiation. Just last month, a trading post had been burned to the ground, and both sides blamed the other. Taking in an injured native man could be seen as choosing sides, could bring trouble down on her head from people who thought she was betraying her own kind. Or she could try to save him, knowing full well that it might kill them both. The storm was getting worse by the minute. Adding an injured man to her wagon would slow her down even more, would make finding shelter even more critical. And if he died anyway despite her efforts, she'd have risked everything for nothing. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, something he'd told her when she was 12 years old and they'd found a wounded coyote in one of their traps. The animal had been suffering, one leg mangled beyond saving, and she'd asked him what they should do. He'd knelt down beside her in the dust, put his hand on her shoulder, and looked her right in the eye. We judge a person, or an animal for that matter, by what they do when nobody's watching, Thea girl. When there's no reward and no recognition. When helping might cost you something and walking away would be easy. That's when you find out who you really are. That's when you find out if you're the kind of person you want to be. Damn it, she muttered, making her decision even as part of her brain screamed that she was being a fool. She stood up, nearly falling as the wind shoved her sideways with enough force to knock her off balance. She caught herself, planting her feet wide, and waded back toward the wagon. From the storage compartment beneath the driver's seat, secured with a leather strap that her frozen fingers fumbled with for several precious seconds, she pulled out a canvas tarp and a coil of rope. Getting him into the wagon bed was going to be hell, but she'd manage. She always managed. The Lockharts didn't quit, didn't give up, didn't let a little thing like impossible odds stop them from doing what needed to be done. It took her 15 minutes that felt like hours, minutes that she measured by the growing numbness in her extremities and the way her muscles screamed in protest with every movement. The man was dead weight and he wasn't small. She guessed he was close to 6 feet tall, with the lean, hardened build of someone who spent their life outdoors, who survived by hunting and tracking and enduring conditions that would kill softer men. Every time she moved him, trying to roll him onto the tarp so she could drag him to the wagon. Fresh blood leaked from his wounds, staining the pristine white snow a bright, arterial red that made her stomach clench with worry. He was losing too much blood. Even if she got him to shelter, even if she managed to treat his wounds, he might have already lost too much. But she couldn't think about that now. Now it was about movement, about action, about getting both of them somewhere that wasn't this exposed hillside where the storm was trying its best to kill them. By the time she had him wrapped in the tarp and loaded into the back of the wagon among the crates and barrels of supplies, her arms were shaking with exhaustion and her lungs burned from breathing cold air. Her back felt like it might give out at any moment, and she'd wrenched something in her shoulder that sent sharp pains shooting down her arm. But he was in. She'd done it. She covered him with every blanket and fur she had in her supplies, save for one thin wool blanket she kept for herself. It wouldn't be enough to truly warm him, but it might be enough to keep him alive until she found shelter. She climbed back into the driver's seat, her movements slow and clumsy now. Her body was starting to shut down, conserving energy, prioritizing vital organs over everything else. She unwrapped the reins from the brake handle with fingers that barely responded to her commands and clicked her tongue to get brandy and whiskey moving again. The horses hesitated, and for a moment she thought they might refuse, might have finally reached their limit. But then Brandy tossed her head and leaned into the harness, and whiskey followed, and the wagon lurched forward into the storm. The lumber camp was out of the question now. Even if the storm hadn't made the trail nearly impossible to navigate, even if her horses weren't on the verge of collapse, she couldn't show up there with an injured native man in her wagon. Jessup Crane and his crew weren't exactly known for their tolerance or compassion. At best, they'd refuse to help. At worst, they might decide the man was responsible for some imagined slight and take matters into their own hands. No, she needed closer shelter. Somewhere isolated where she could tend to his wounds without interference or judgment. She ran through her mental map of the area, trying to remember what was nearby. There was an old trapper's cabin about 3 miles east, tucked into a draw at the base of Greyback Mountain. She'd passed it dozens of times over the years, always empty, slowly falling apart as weather and time did their inevitable work. The trapper who'd built it, a French-Canadian named Baptiste something or other, had died nearly 10 years ago, frozen to death in a late spring blizzard not unlike this one. Since then, the cabin had been used occasionally by hunters and travelers as emergency shelter, but nobody maintained it or claimed ownership. It wasn't much, probably just one room with a fireplace, and whatever furniture hadn't been scavenged or hadn't rotted away. But it would have 4 walls and a roof, and right now that was everything. Thea turned the horses off what she thought was the main trail, heading into rougher country. The wagon bounced and creaked ominously as the wheels found every rock and rut hidden beneath the snow. She worried about the axles breaking, about the man in the back being jostled so badly his wounds would tear open even worse than they already were. But there was nothing she could do about it except keep going and pray that her memory was accurate, that the cabin was where she thought it was, and that it was still standing. The wind seemed to get stronger with every passing minute, until it felt like the storm was actively trying to push them back, to punish them for daring to move forward. Snow piled up on Thea's shoulders and hat, accumulating so fast she had to brush it off every few minutes or risk being buried where she sat. Her face had gone completely numb an hour ago, and she'd stopped being able to feel her toes even longer ago than that. She wasn't shivering anymore either, which she knew was a very bad sign. When you stopped shivering, it meant your body was giving up on trying to generate heat, was conserving energy for vital organs and letting the extremities go. Frostbite was a real possibility now. She might lose fingers or toes before this was over. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today was about survival. Not yet, she told herself through gritted teeth, the words slurring slightly as her cold, numbed lips struggled to form them properly. Not yet, not yet, not yet. Just a little further. Dad didn't raise a quitter. Keep moving. Keep going. She almost missed the cabin entirely. The storm had reduced visibility to nearly nothing, and the structure itself was so weathered and grey that it blended almost perfectly with the rocks and trees around it. It was only because Brandy suddenly stopped, planting her feet and refusing to go forward despite Thea's urging, that she looked up and really focused on what was in front of them. And there it was, barely visible through the curtains of falling snow, a dark shape that was too regular to be natural. Relief flooded through her so intensely it was almost painful, bringing tears to her eyes that froze on her cheeks almost immediately. The cabin was in worse shape than she'd remembered from her last glimpse of it months ago. The door hung crooked on its leather hinges, one of them torn partially free from the frame. There were gaps in the log walls where the chinking had fallen out, letting in streams of snow and wind. Part of the roof had collapsed on one side, though the main structure seemed intact. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. It was 4 walls and protection from the wind, and that might be enough to keep them alive through the night. She guided the horses around to the side of the cabin where they'd have some protection from the worst of the wind, then jumped down from the wagon. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground, and she had to grab the wheel to keep from falling. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, gathering what little strength she had left. Then she started unloading. Getting the man inside was another ordeal that tested every ounce of strength Thea had left in her body. She'd thought loading him into the wagon had been difficult, but that was nothing compared to dragging his dead weight through knee-deep snow and over the threshold of the cabin. He regained consciousness briefly when she pulled him off the wagon bed, his eyes snapping open with a look of wild confusion and fear. For a moment, she thought he might fight her, might lash out in his disoriented state, and her hand moved instinctively toward the knife at her belt. But then his gaze focused on her face, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, though not of her specifically. Recognition that she was trying to help, that she wasn't the enemy. Easy, she told him, her voice hoarse and rough from the cold and exertion. I'm trying to help you, understand? I need you to work with me here. Can you move your legs at all? I can't do this alone. To her surprise and relief, he responded. He couldn't walk on his own. That much was clear from the way his legs buckled when he tried to put weight on them. But he managed to get them under him enough that she could take most of his weight against her shoulder and half carry, half drag him through the snow. Each step was agony. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her injured shoulder sent lightning bolts of pain down her arm, and her lungs burned with every gasping breath. The man was doing his best to help. She could feel him trying to push with his legs, trying to keep some of his weight off her. But he was fading fast. By the time they reached the cabin door, he was barely conscious again. his head lolling against her shoulder. They collapsed together just inside the threshold, landing in a heap on the dirt floor that was mercifully free of snow. Thea lay there for a long moment, just breathing, staring up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling. The man's weight was still partially on top of her, and she could feel the sticky warmth of fresh blood soaking through her coat. That wasn't good. The wounds had opened up again during the move. She needed to get them cleaned and stitched soon, before he lost any more blood. "Stay awake," Thea ordered, shoving at his shoulder to roll him off her. Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended, but exhaustion and fear were making her irritable. "Do you hear me? You need to stay awake. What's your name? Tell me your name." His lips moved, forming words she could barely hear. She leaned closer, her ear near his mouth. "Hota," he whispered, the word barely audible. "My name is Hota." "Hota," she repeated, committing it to memory. It was easier to fight for someone when they had a name. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, when they were a person rather than just a stranger. I'm Thea Lockhart. You're going to be fine, Hota, but you need to stay with me. Can you do that?" He didn't answer, his eyes sliding closed again. She bit back a curse and pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over her. There was no time to rest. She still had work to do, supplies to bring in, horses to tend to, a fire to start. The temperature inside the cabin was barely better than outside, maybe a few degrees warmer from being sheltered from the wind. But that wouldn't last long without heat. Thea went back out into the storm 3 more times, and each trip was harder than the last. Her body was shutting down, moving on pure stubbornness and force of will. The first trip was for her medical supplies, a battered leather bag that her father had put together over years of traveling dangerous country. It contained needles and thread, bandages made from torn sheets, a bottle of whiskey for sterilizing wounds, some laudanum for pain, and various herbs and remedies that her mother had taught her about before she died when Thea was young. The second trip was for firewood, and she had to dig through snow to reach the small covered pile she'd spotted beside the cabin. The wood was old and dry, probably left by the last person to use this place, and she said a silent prayer of thanks to whatever anonymous traveler had thought to leave shelter and fuel for the next desperate soul who might need it. The third trip was for the horses, and it nearly broke her. Leading brandy and whiskey around to what had probably been a small stable or lean-to, attached to the cabin's side, was like moving through molasses. The structure was missing half its roof, and one wall had collapsed entirely, but it would provide some protection from the wind and snow. It would have to be enough. She unhitched them from the wagon with fumbling fingers, removed their harnesses, and rubbed them down as best she could with an old blanket. They were both shivering, their coats thick with ice, and she knew they were dangerously cold. But they were tough animals, bred for this kind of weather, and they'd survived worse. She dumped out some grain from one of her supply barrels, more than she would normally give them, but they'd earned it today and made sure they had access to snow they could eat for water. It wasn't ideal. Eating snow could actually make them colder, but it was better than nothing. "I'm sorry, girls," she murmured, stroking Brandy's nose with a hand she could barely feel. "I'm sorry I got you into this, but we're alive and that's what matters. We'll rest here tonight, and tomorrow when the storm breaks, we'll figure out what comes next." By the time she made it back inside the cabin for the final time, closing the door behind her and wedging it shut with a piece of broken furniture, she was moving on pure autopilot. Her brain felt fuzzy and distant, like she was watching herself from somewhere far away. That was another sign of hypothermia she knew. The disconnection, the feeling that everything was happening to someone else. She needed heat, needed it desperately, or she'd be in as much danger as Hota was. The fireplace was small, just a simple stone structure with a chimney that looked like it might or might not still be clear. Thea knelt in front of it, her knees protesting at the movement, and began building a fire with shaking hands. She arranged the kindling in a small pyramid the way her father had taught her, placed the larger pieces of wood nearby so she could add them once the fire caught. Getting the match lit took 4 tries. Her fingers wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't grip the small wooden stick properly. But finally, on the 5th attempt, she got it struck and held the flame to the kindling. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The kindling was damp from being exposed to moisture, and the flame guttered and nearly went out. Thea found herself holding her breath, leaning forward, silently begging the fire to catch. If it didn't, if the wood was too wet or the chimney was blocked, they were both going to die in this cabin. But then, like a miracle, a small tongue of flame licked up the side of one piece of kindling, then another. The fire caught, spreading quickly through the dry inner wood, and suddenly there was light and warmth. It felt like the most beautiful thing Thea had ever seen. She fed the fire carefully, adding larger pieces once the kindling was burning well, building it up until real heat began radiating out into the small space. The cabin was barely bigger than a large bedroom, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet, with a single window that had lost its shutters years ago and was now just a dark opening that let in wind and snow. She'd have to block that somehow, but first things first. The fire was going, and that meant they had a chance. Thea turned her attention back to Hotta, who lay where she'd left him near the door. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly now, could assess just how bad his condition really was. And it was bad. The man was fading fast. His skin had taken on a greyish cast that spoke of severe blood loss and shock, and his breathing was so shallow she had to watch carefully to see his chest rise and fall. The blood had soaked through the tarpan blankets she'd wrapped him in, creating dark stains that looked black in the flickering light. She dragged him closer to the fire, positioning him on his uninjured side, then began the painstaking process of removing his wet clothing. His buckskin shirt was ruined, soaked with blood and melted snow, and she had to cut it away with her hunting knife. Beneath it, his chest and torso were lean and muscular, the body of someone who lived a physically demanding life. But that healthy physique was marred by injuries that made her breath catch in her throat. The gash across his ribs was even worse than she'd thought. It ran from just below his left armpit, almost to his navel, a deep slash that had cut through skin and muscle. She could see white bone in places where the wound gaped widest. This hadn't been caused by an arrow. This was a knife wound, and whoever had wielded that knife had been trying to kill him. The edges of the wound were ragged and dirty, contaminated with debris from being dragged through the snow. If infection set in, and it almost certainly would without proper treatment, he'd be dead within days. The head injury was concerning too, but probably not life-threatening if she could keep the swelling down. The cut above his eye had mostly stopped bleeding, but the bone beneath was definitely fractured. She could feel the irregularity when she gently probed the area with her fingers, feel the way the bone shifted slightly under the swollen tissue. He'd have a hell of a headache when he woke up, assuming he woke up at all. Thea opened her medical bag with hands that were finally starting to regain some feeling, though the returning sensation brought pins and needles that were almost painful. She pulled out the bottle of whiskey first, uncorked it and took a long swallow. The alcohol burned going down, but it helped. It cleared some of the fog from her brain and steadied her nerves. Then she poured a generous amount over her hands, sterilizing them as best she could under the circumstances. Cleaning the wounds was brutal work. She had to flush out all the dirt and debris, had to cut away ragged edges of skin that wouldn't heal properly, had to probe the depths of the gash to make sure there were no foreign objects lodged inside. Hotta regained consciousness twice during this process, his body going rigid with pain, a strangled sound escaping his throat. The second time, his eyes opened and focused on her with an intensity that was almost frightening. For a moment, she saw the warrior he must be when healthy and whole, saw the strength and determination that had kept him alive this long. Then the pain overwhelmed him again, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. "I'm sorry," she murmured as she worked, talking partly to him and partly to herself. The sound of her own voice helped keep her focused, kept her hands steady. "I know this hurts. I know you're probably cursing me right now in your head. But if I don't get this cleaned out properly, infection will kill you faster than the blood loss. So just hang on. Stay with me. Threading the needle was harder than it should have been. Her hands were steadier now that she'd warmed up some, but exhaustion was making them tremble. It took 3 attempts before she got the thread through the eye, and then she was ready to begin stitching. She'd done this before, had sewn up injuries on horses and cattle, and even on her father that one time. But those had been smaller wounds, cleaner cuts. This was different. This was extensive damage that would require dozens of stitches and all the skill she possessed. She started at the top of the wound, near his ribs, and worked her way down. Each stitch had to be placed carefully, close enough together that the wound would close properly, but not so tight that it would tear the damaged tissue. The firelight made it difficult to see clearly, casting shadows that shifted and moved with the flames. Twice she had to stop and add more wood to the fire, and each time she resumed, she had to reorient herself, had to find where she'd left off. Hota's breathing changed about halfway through the stitching, becoming faster and more labored. She paused, pressing her fingers against his neck to check his pulse. It was racing, his heart beating too fast as his body fought to compensate for the blood loss. He needed fluids, needed rest, needed care that was far beyond what she could provide in this primitive cabin with her limited supplies. But she was all he had, and she'd be damned if she let him die after all the effort it had taken to get him here. "You're a fighter," she said, resuming her work. "I can tell. Nobody survives an ambush like that by being weak. Nobody makes it through a blizzard with injuries like these by giving up. So don't you dare quit on me now, Hota. Don't you dare." By the time she finished stitching and bandaging his wounds, her hands were cramping and her eyes were burning with fatigue. She'd used nearly all the thread in her medical bag and most of the clean bandages. The stitches weren't pretty, but they were functional. They'd hold if he didn't move around too much, if he gave his body time to heal. She covered the bandaged wound with a clean cloth, then wrapped his entire torso with strips torn from one of her spare shirts to hold everything in place. The head wound required different treatment. She couldn't stitch it closed, not with the bone fractured beneath. Instead, she cleaned it thoroughly with whiskey, applied a poultice made from herbs she kept in her medical bag, yarrow to stop bleeding and comfrey to reduce swelling, and then wrapped his head with a bandage that covered his right eye and most of his forehead. He looked like he'd been through a war, which in a sense he had. With the immediate medical crisis addressed, Thea turned her attention to keeping him warm. She positioned him even closer to the fire, close enough that she worried about sparks, but far enough that he wouldn't burn. Then she covered him with every blanket and fur she had, creating a cocoon that would trap his body heat. His wet buckskin pants needed to come off too, but that was a problem for later, when she had more energy. For now, she'd done everything she could. The cabin itself needed attention too. The wind was still howling outside, and snow was drifting in through the gaps in the walls and through the broken window. Thea stuffed the gaps with spare fabric from her supplies, with pieces of bark and moss she found scattered around the cabin floor, with anything that would block the wind. The window was harder to deal with. She ended up nailing a piece of canvas over it, using nails she found scattered in corners and a rock as a hammer. It wasn't perfect, but it cut the draft significantly. By the time she finished all these tasks, she was swaying on her feet with exhaustion. She checked on Hota one more time, pressing her ear to his chest to listen to his breathing, checking his pulse, touching his forehead to assess if fever was setting in yet. His skin was warmer than before, which was good. It meant the fire and blankets were working. But he was still too pale, and his breathing was still too shallow. The next 24 hours would be critical. If he made it through the night without the wounds becoming infected, if he made it through tomorrow without fever spiking or the stitches tearing, then he might actually survive. Thea finally allowed herself to sit down, her back against the wall opposite the fire, her rifle laid across her lap. She should eat something, should force down some of the dried meat and hardtack she kept in her supplies. But the thought of food made her stomach turn. Exhaustion had moved beyond hunger into a state where eating seemed impossible. Instead, she just sat there watching Hota's chest rise and fall, listening to the storm rage outside. She found herself studying him in the firelight, really looking at him for the first time since she'd found him in the snow. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably only a few years older than herself, maybe 27 or 28 at most. His face, what she could see of it beneath the bandages, was striking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once before and healed slightly crooked. His hair was long, falling past his shoulders, and even matted with ice and blood, it was clearly well cared for under normal circumstances. There was something almost familiar about him, though she couldn't place why. Maybe she'd seen him in town before, though that seemed unlikely. The tribes that lived in these mountains, the Salish and Kootenai peoples who'd inhabited this land long before white settlers arrived, didn't come into the towns much anymore. The relationship between the settlers and the tribes had always been complicated, a mixture of trade and tension, respect and resentment. But in recent months things had gotten worse. The territorial governor, a man named Harrison Wolcott, who'd been appointed by Washington, and who seemed to have no understanding of or interest in the delicate balance that existed out here, had been pushing hard for what he called progress. That meant more land for mining, more territory opened up for logging, more restrictions on where the tribes could hunt and fish. The reservation system was already controversial, confining people who'd once ranged freely across thousands of miles to small parcels of often poor-quality land. Now Wolcott wanted to shrink those reservations even further, to move the tribes to even more remote and inhospitable areas. The tribes had protested, of course. There'd been meetings, negotiations that went nowhere, angry confrontations at the boundaries of reservation land. And then the violence had started. Small incidents at first, a burned trading post here, a stolen herd of cattle there, accusations flying from both sides about who started what. 3 weeks ago, a survey crew working for a mining company had been attacked, 2 men killed, and the rest barely escaping with their lives. The governor had called it an act of war and demanded military intervention. The tribal leaders had denied responsibility, said it was the work of rogue elements they didn't control. But nobody in the white settlements believed them. Thea had tried to stay out of it, tried to remain neutral. Her business depended on being able to travel freely through territory that belonged, at least technically, to multiple groups. She traded with settlers and miners and loggers, but she also traded sometimes with tribal hunting parties she met on the trail, exchanging goods in a way that benefited everyone. Her father had taught her that commerce and mutual benefit were better paths to peace than politics and posturing. But neutrality was becoming harder to maintain. People were starting to demand you pick a side, starting to view anyone who wouldn't take a clear stance with suspicion. And now here she was, alone in a cabin with a severely injured native man who'd been ambushed and left for dead. The smart thing to do, the safe thing, would be to patch him up as best she could, and then distance herself from whatever trouble he was involved in. Get him stable enough to travel, point him toward his people, and wash her hands of the whole situation. But something about that felt wrong, felt like a betrayal of the values her father had instilled in her. He'd always said that you judged people by their character, not by their ancestry or the color of their skin. That honor meant helping those who needed help, regardless of who they were or where they came from. A sound from Hota pulled her from her thoughts. He was stirring, his head moving restlessly against the blankets, his lips forming words she couldn't understand. She set aside her rifle and moved to his side, kneeling down and placing a hand on his shoulder to still him. "Easy," she said softly. "Don't move too much. You'll tear the stitches." His eyes opened, and for the first time since she'd found him, they were truly focused and aware. He stared at her for a long moment, taking in her face, the cabin around them, the fire crackling nearby. She could see him processing, trying to understand where he was and how he'd gotten here. Then his gaze moved down to his bandaged torso, and she saw comprehension dawn in his eyes. "You saved me," he said. his voice rough and barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. "I found you in the snow," Thea replied, sitting back on her heels. "You were dying. I couldn't just leave you there." "Many would have," Hotar said, and there was something in his tone that spoke of experience, of having seen the worst of what people could do to each other. "Why didn't you?" It was a fair question, and one she wasn't sure she could answer completely. She settled for a simple truth, because it was the right thing to do. He studied her face for another long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her, could read all her doubts and fears and uncertainties. Then he nodded slightly, a small movement that made him wince with pain. "Thank you, Thea Lockhart." The fact that he remembered her name, remembered their brief exchange when she'd first brought him inside, surprised her. It meant his mind was still sharp despite the injuries, still processing and filing away information. That was a good sign. "You need to rest," she told him. "You lost a lot of blood, and those wounds need time to heal. We're stuck here until the storm passes anyway, so just focus on staying alive." "The storm," Hotar repeated, his eyes shifting toward the door. How long has it been?" "Mummy, I found you maybe 3 hours ago," Thea said, though honestly she wasn't entirely sure. Time had become fluid and strange in the chaos of survival. "We're in an old trapper's cabin at the base of Greyback Mountain." "Do you know it?" He nodded again, more carefully this time. "Baptiste's cabin, I know it. I've sheltered here before, years ago when I was younger." There was something about the way he said that, "when I was younger," that struck her as odd. It implied a familiarity with this country that went beyond just passing through, implied a life spent ranging through these mountains. "Who are you?" she asked, the question coming out before she could stop it. "I mean, I know your name is Hotar, but who are you really? What were you doing out in this storm? And who ambushed you?" His expression closed off immediately, and she knew she'd pushed too hard too fast. "That's a complicated story," he said finally, "and one that might be dangerous for you to know. I think I've earned the right to know," Thea shot back, a flash of anger cutting through her exhaustion. "I risked my life to save you. I hauled you through a blizzard, stitched up wounds that should have been tended by a real doctor, and used up supplies I can't easily replace. So yes, Hotar, I think you owe me at least some kind of explanation." He was quiet for so long, she thought he might refuse to answer. But then he sighed, a sound heavy with pain and something else, maybe regret or resignation. "You're right," he said quietly. "You do deserve to know, but not tonight. Tonight, I can barely think straight, and this story requires clarity. Ask me again tomorrow, when the storm has passed, and we're both less likely to die from cold or blood loss. I promise, I'll tell you everything then." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was probably the best she was going to get. Thea nodded and stood up, moving back to her spot against the wall. She was too tired to argue, too tired to push for answers that might not matter if they didn't survive the night. "Get some rest," she said. "I'll keep the fire going." "You need rest too," Hotar observed, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "You look like you're about to collapse." "Maybe," she admitted. "But someone needs to stay awake, needs to keep watch. That ambush you mentioned, if those men are still looking for you, if they tracked you here, they won't come in this storm," Hotar said with certainty. "No one is that dedicated or that foolish. We're safe until morning at least." Thea wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she couldn't let her guard down. But her body was betraying her, exhaustion pulling her down like a physical weight. Her eyelids were so heavy, and the warmth of the fire after hours in the cold was intoxicating. "Just for a few minutes," she murmured, letting her eyes close. "Just a short rest. Sleep, Thea Lockhart." Hotar's voice came from across the cabin, soft and somehow reassuring. "You've earned it. I'll wake you if anything happens." She wanted to protest that he was in no condition to keep watch, that he was the injured one who needed rest more than she did. But the words wouldn't come, and the darkness was rising up to claim her. Her last conscious thought was a simple one. She'd saved a stranger's life today, and tomorrow she'd find out if that made her a hero or a fool. Thea woke to the sound of silence, and that was what told her immediately that something had changed. The storm had stopped. The howling wind, that had been a constant presence for hours, that had become almost like background noise her exhausted brain had learned to filter out, was gone. In its place was a stillness so complete it was almost unnerving. She opened her eyes slowly, her body protesting the movement with a chorus of aches and pains. Every muscle felt like it had been beaten with hammers, and her shoulder, the one she'd wrenched while loading Hotar into the wagon, sent a sharp spike of agony down her arm when she tried to shift position. The fire had burned down to coals while she slept, casting a dim red glow through the cabin. Grey morning light filtered in through the gaps in the walls and around the canvas she'd nailed over the window, enough to see by but not enough to be called bright. She had no idea what time it was, whether it was early morning or nearly noon. Her internal clock, usually reliable, had been thrown off by the exhaustion and trauma of the previous day. Thea pushed herself to her feet, biting back a groan as her stiff joints complained. She felt like she'd aged 20 years overnight. Moving to the fireplace, she added kindling and fresh wood to the coals, coaxing them back to life. The flames caught quickly, and soon real warmth was radiating through the small space again. Only then did she allow herself to look over at Hotar. He was awake, watching her with those dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. In the better light of morning, she could see more details she'd missed the night before. The bandage around his head was stained with dried blood, but no fresh seepage, which was a good sign. His color was better too, still pale, but no longer that terrifying grey that had made him look like a corpse. He'd managed to prop himself up slightly against the wall, though the effort had clearly cost him based on the tight lines of pain around his mouth. "You should be lying down," Thea said, her voice coming out rougher than she'd expected. Her throat was raw from breathing cold air. "Those stitches won't hold if you move around too much. I've been lying down for hours," Hotar replied. His voice was stronger than the night before, though still strained. "Besides, I wanted to be sitting up when we had the conversation you're owed." Thea moved to check his wounds, kneeling beside him and carefully lifting the blankets. The bandages around his torso were stained with blood, but again it looked like old blood rather than fresh. She pressed her fingers gently against the area around the stitches, checking for heat or swelling that might indicate infection starting. The skin was warm but not abnormally so. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I was stabbed and left to die in a blizzard," he said, and there was a hint of dark humor in his tone. "But alive, which I assume means you did good work with those stitches. I've had enough wounds to know the difference between field medicine done well and field medicine done poorly." "You've been injured before," Thea observed, and it wasn't really a question. Now that she could see his torso in better light, she noticed the scars. Old knife wounds, what looked like a healed bullet graze across his left shoulder, burn marks on his right forearm. This was a man who'd lived a violent life. "Many times," Hotar confirmed, "though this is probably the closest I've come to actually dying. If you hadn't found me when you did, I would have frozen within the hour. The cold was already taking me when I heard your wagon." Thea finished her examination and sat back, satisfied that he was stable for now. "You promised me answers," she said. "Starting with who you really are and why someone wanted you dead badly enough to ambush you in the worst storm of the year. Estune, she." Hotar was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and serious. "My full name is Hota Many Horses. I'm the only son of Chief Apata Many Horses, leader of the Mountain Salish band that has lived in these territories for more generations than any white man has kept record of. The men who ambushed me were sent by someone who wants to start a war, and now that they've attacked me, they might very well get what they want." The words hit Thea like a physical blow, and she felt her stomach drop. The chief's son. She'd saved the chief's son. The implications crashed over her one after another like waves. This wasn't just some random hunter or warrior. This was someone important, someone whose death or survival could have consequences that rippled out far beyond this cabin. "Oh God," she breathed. "Now you understand why I said this knowledge might be dangerous for you." Hota said, and there was sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I would have told you last night, but I needed to be certain you were someone who could be trusted with this information. Someone who wouldn't immediately turn me over to the territorial authorities or worse." Thea's mind was racing, trying to process everything this meant. "The ambush," she said slowly. "Who were they? Who would dare attack the chief's son? That's an act of war on its own." "White men," Hota said flatly. "4 of them, maybe 5. It was hard to tell in the storm. They were dressed like trappers or prospectors, but they moved like soldiers, like men trained to kill. They knew the land well enough to set up an ambush in that weather, which means they'd been tracking me for some time. And they used both arrows and knives, trying to make it look like a tribal attack, trying to muddy the waters about who was responsible." "But why?" Thea asked. "What would anyone gain from killing you? Wouldn't your death just enrage your people, make negotiations harder, make violence more likely?" "Not exactly," Hota said, and his expression was grim. "There are people, both among your kind and mine, who want war, who believe that only through conflict can their goals be achieved. Among the whites, there are men who see my people as obstacles to wealth and expansion. Men who own mining companies or lumber operations, who've bought politicians and territorial governors. They want our land, Thea. They want the gold in our mountains, the timber in our forests, the water in our streams. And as long as my father maintains peace, as long as he negotiates and compromises and finds ways to coexist with the settlers, those men can't simply take what they want." He paused, wincing as a wave of pain crossed his face. Thea reached for the laudanum in her medical bag, but he waved her off. "Not yet. I need to finish this while my mind is clear. Among my people there are also those who want war. Young warriors who are tired of watching our lands shrink year after year, who see every treaty as a surrender and every negotiation as weakness. My father's path of peace has kept our people alive, has prevented the kind of slaughter that happened to tribes in other territories. But it's also meant giving up much of what we once held. Some see me as my father's heir, someone who will continue his policies. They want me gone, want someone more aggressive to take my place." Thea absorbed this understanding dawning. "So you have enemies on both sides. White men who want to provoke a war by killing you and blaming it on rival tribes. And members of your own people who see you as an obstacle to more aggressive resistance. That's the situation in its simplest form," Hota agreed. "Though the reality is more complicated. Not all whites want war, and not all of my people want peace. There are good men and bad men on both sides, people acting from principle and people acting from greed or fear. But yes, my death would serve certain agendas very well, which is why those men were trying to kill me, and why they'll probably try again once they realize I survived." A chill ran down Thea's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "They'll come looking for you. Once the storm clears enough for travel, they'll backtrack. Try to find your body to confirm the kill. And they'll find this cabin instead, possibly," Hota said. "Though the storm will have covered most of the tracks. And they may assume I died and was buried by the snow, that animals will scatter any remains before spring. Still, you're right that there's risk, which is why I need to leave as soon as I'm able to travel. I can't let you be caught up in this more than you already are. You can barely sit up," Thea pointed out. "You're not traveling anywhere for at least a few days, probably longer. Those stitches need time to set, and you need to regain your strength. If you try to move now, you'll tear everything open and bleed out before you make it a mile. Then I'll put you in danger," Hota said, frustration evident in his voice. "Don't you understand? If anyone finds out you helped me, if anyone discovers you gave shelter and medical care to the chief's son, you'll be seen as taking sides. Your business will be ruined at minimum. At worst, you could be accused of conspiracy, of aiding the enemy. There are men who would use any excuse to seize your property, to drive you out of the territory. I won't let that happen because of my problems." Thea stood up and moved to the door, pulling aside the canvas she'd used to block it and peering outside. The world had been transformed overnight. Snow lay thick and pristine as far as she could see, covering everything in white that sparkled in the morning sun. The sky was clear now, a brilliant blue that seemed impossible after the grey fury of yesterday's storm. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and it was also deeply problematic. That much snow meant travel would be difficult for days, maybe a week or more, depending on temperature. The trails would be impassable until either the snow melted or enough people traveled them to pack down paths. She turned back to Hotar, her decision made. I'm not leaving you to die because I'm afraid of consequences. And I'm not going to let you leave before you're healed enough to have a real chance of survival. So, here's what's going to happen. We're going to stay here for as long as it takes for you to recover enough to travel safely. 2 days minimum, probably 3 or 4. I'll take care of the horses, manage our supplies, and keep watch for any trouble. You're going to rest, let your body heal, and not do anything stupid that will tear open those stitches. Understand? Hotar stared at her for a long moment, and she couldn't read his expression. Then slowly he nodded. You're either very brave or very foolish, Thea Lockhart. I haven't decided which yet, probably both, she admitted. But it's too late to change course now. Besides, I have questions and you're going to answer them while we're stuck here together, starting with what you were doing out in that storm in the first place. Your father is chief, which means you're important to your people. Why were you traveling alone in weather that any sane person would avoid? I wasn't alone initially, Hota said. I was with 2 warriors, friends I've known since childhood. We were on our way back from a meeting with one of the smaller bands that lives higher in the mountains. My father sent us to discuss the latest demands from the territorial governor to coordinate our response. It was supposed to be a quick trip, 3 days at most. We left before the storm hit. Thought we'd make it back to our winter camp before the weather turned bad. What happened to the others? Thea asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dead, Hotar said flatly, and for the first time since waking, she saw real emotion crack through his controlled exterior. Grief raw and sharp. The ambush hit us at dawn yesterday, right as the storm was starting. We were in a narrow canyon, stupid place to be, but we were trying to find shelter. They came from above, had the high ground and the advantage of surprise. Dakota died in the first volley, 3 arrows before he could even draw his weapon. Chaska managed to fight back, killed at least one of them, I think, but they swarmed him. I saw him go down before I could reach him. I'm sorry, Thea said quietly and meant it. She understood loss, understood the particular pain of losing people you cared about. Hotar nodded acknowledgement. I managed to get to my horse, thought I could outrun them in the storm. But they shot the horse out from under me, and then one of them came in close with a knife. I fought him, managed to take his blade, and cut him badly enough that he fell back. But not before he opened up my side. I ran after that, stumbled through the snow half blind from the head wound, just trying to put distance between us. I don't really remember much after that until I heard your voice. The story painted a vivid and brutal picture. Thea could imagine it. The chaos and violence of the ambush, the desperation of trying to escape through a blizzard while bleeding heavily. The fact that Hotar had survived at all was remarkable. The men who attacked you, she said. You said they moved like soldiers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Do you think they were working for the territorial government? For Governor Wolcott? Indeed, possibly, though I doubt Wolcott would be stupid enough to order something like this directly. More likely, they were hired by one of the mining companies or land speculators who've been pressuring him to take a harder line with the tribes. Men with money and no conscience who see violence as just another business expense. But I can't prove any of that. All I have are suspicions and the memory of men who were too well organized to be random bandits. Thea moved to her supply crates, pulling out dried venison and hardtack. They both needed to eat, needed to keep their strength up. She prepared a simple meal, softening the hardtack in water heated by the fire and cutting the venison into pieces, small enough to chew easily. When she brought Hotar his portion, she helped him sit up more fully, ignoring his protests that he could manage on his own. You need to eat, she said firmly. Can't heal without fuel for your body." They ate in silence for a few minutes, and Thea found herself studying him again. In the full light of day, without the urgency of medical crisis, she could see him as a person, rather than just an injured stranger. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with conventional features and everything to do with presence and character. There was intelligence in his eyes, a sharpness that suggested he was always thinking, always analyzing. And there was something else too, a kind of quiet strength that she recognized because she'd seen it in her father. The strength of someone who'd been tested by life and had refused to break. "Tell me about your father," she said suddenly. "About the chief. What kind of man is he?" Hota looked surprised by the question, but after a moment he smiled slightly. It was the first time she'd seen anything approaching happiness on his face. "He's the best man I know," he said simply. "Strong but not cruel, firm but not rigid. He became chief when he was very young, barely 25, after the previous chief died in a hunting accident. Everyone expected him to fail, thought he was too young and inexperienced. But he proved them wrong. He led our people through the first waves of white settlement, negotiated treaties that actually gave us something in return for what we gave up. Kept us from being destroyed the way so many other tribes were. He taught me everything I know about leadership, about the responsibility that comes with power. He taught me that strength isn't just about how well you fight, but about how well you think, how clearly you can see all sides of a problem. He taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose peace when everyone around you is calling for war." Hota paused, his expression growing more serious. "But he's getting older now, and the burden of leadership weighs heavily on him. The last few years especially, with the pressure from Wolcott and the mining companies, with the tensions growing within our own people, it's aged him. He needs me to be ready to take his place when the time comes. Which is why my enemies wanted me dead. They know that without me, the path my father has charted might die with him." Thea absorbed this, understanding more now about what was at stake. This wasn't just about one man's life or death. This was about the future of an entire people, about whether peace or war would define the coming years. "What will happen when you don't return?" she asked. "When your father learns you've been attacked." That depends on who brings him the news and how they frame it," Hota said. "If the warriors who wanted me dead get to him first, they'll claim I was killed by white settlers, will use it to push for retaliation. If my father's more level-headed advisors reach him first, they'll urge caution and investigation. Either way, my absence will create instability. Power abhors a vacuum, and there are those who will try to fill the space I leave behind. Then we need to get you back to your people as soon as possible," Thea said. "Not so soon that you die trying, but not so late that the situation spirals out of control." She moved to the door again, scanning the pristine snow outside. Everything looked peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling they were on borrowed time. Somewhere out there, dangerous men might be making plans. "We should take inventory of supplies," she said, turning back. "Figure out what we have, how long we can hold out here if we need to. And I need to check those stitches again later today." "You're very determined," Hota observed. "Someone has to be," Thea replied. "I didn't drag you through a blizzard just to watch you die from poor planning." The second day in the cabin brought a different kind of tension. One that had nothing to do with storms or survival, and everything to do with two people from completely different worlds learning to exist in close quarters. Thea had woken at first light, her body still aching but functional. The first thing she'd done was check on Hota, who was sleeping deeply, his breathing steady and strong. That was good. Sleep was healing, and his body needed all the healing it could get. She'd built up the fire, careful to be quiet. They'd bundled herself in her heavy coat and gone outside to tend to the horses. The morning was brutally cold, the kind of cold that made your lungs hurt with every breath and turned any exposed skin numb within seconds. But the sky was still clear, a pale winter blue that stretched endlessly overhead. The snow had settled some overnight, compacting under its own weight, but it still stood nearly 2 feet deep in most places. Her wagon was half buried, and she'd spent an hour digging it out, checking the axles and wheels for damage. Everything seemed intact, which was a relief. She'd need that wagon when they finally left this place. Brandy and whiskey were in decent shape, considering what they'd been through. She'd given them extra grain again, brushed them down thoroughly, and checked their legs and hooves for any signs of injury or frostbite. They were tough animals, and they'd weathered the storm better than she'd dared hope. Still, they needed rest and regular feed, and she couldn't keep them in this makeshift shelter indefinitely. Another 3 days at most, she figured, before she'd need to either move them somewhere better or risk their health declining. When she'd returned to the cabin, stamping snow off her boots and shaking ice from her coat, she'd found Hotar awake and trying to stand. She'd crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pushed him back down with a hand on his shoulder. "What do you think you're doing?" She demanded. "I need to relieve myself," he'd said, his tone somewhere between embarrassed and defiant. "Unless you expect me to do it right here on the floor." That had brought Thea up short. She hadn't thought about the practicalities of having an injured man who couldn't move easily. "Right," she'd said, feeling her face heat slightly. "There's a chamber pot in the corner. Can you make it that far if I help you?" It had been an awkward, painful process, getting him across the small cabin. Hotar had gritted his teeth against the pain, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the cold, but he'd managed with her support. She'd given him privacy after that, busying herself with preparing a breakfast of boiled oats and dried berries while he dealt with his business. When he'd called out that he was done, she'd helped him back to his bedroll by the fire. "Thank you," he'd said quietly, once he was settled again. "I know this isn't what you signed up for when you decided to save my life." "Nobody ever signs up for the hard parts," Thea had replied, handing him a bowl of the hot oats. "But we deal with them anyway because that's what decent people do." Now, several hours later, they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been the day before. Hotar was eating better, keeping down the food and even asking for seconds, which Thea took as a good sign. His color had improved too, more bronze than grey now, though the bruising around his head wound had darkened to an ugly purple that spread down to his cheekbone. "Tell me about your business," Hotar said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "You said your father built it. What made him decide to become a supply runner in this territory?" Thea considered the question, surprised by his interest. Most men she'd met, white or otherwise, didn't much care about the details of trade and commerce unless it directly affected them. "He was a trader originally," she said. "Came west from Pennsylvania back in the 40s, when this was still wild country, barely mapped. He traded with everyone. Trappers, miners, settlers, tribal bands, didn't matter to him, as long as the exchange was fair. He always said that commerce was the best path to peace, that people who depend on each other for goods and services are less likely to kill each other." "A wise philosophy," Hotar observed, "though not one that's very popular these days on either side of the divide." "No," Thea agreed. "The world's gotten meaner since he started. Or maybe it was always mean, and he just saw a way to navigate it that worked for him. Either way, he built a reputation for reliability and fairness. When he settled in Silverpine and started running regular supply routes to the mining and lumber camps, people knew they could trust him. His word was his bond, and he never shorted anyone or delivered inferior goods. That reputation kept us in business even when times were tough. And now you carry that reputation," Hotar said. "That's a heavy burden for one person, especially a young woman in a territory that doesn't always treat women with respect." Thea snorted. "That's putting it mildly. Half the men I deal with think I'm going to fail any day now, that I'm just keeping the business running until I find a husband to take it over. The other half resent that I'm doing what they think only men should do. But they still buy from me because I deliver on time and my prices are fair. And in the end, that's what matters in business. Do you want to find a husband?" Hotar asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, not judgment. Eventually, maybe, Thea said honestly, but not because I need someone to rescue me or take over my business. If I marry, it'll be because I find someone who respects what I've built, who sees me as a partner rather than a problem to be solved. Someone who understands that I'm not going to give up who I am just to fit into someone else's idea of what a wife should be. That's a tall order in this territory, Hotar said with a slight smile. Most white men I've encountered have very fixed ideas about women's roles. Most men, period, have fixed ideas about women's roles, Thea countered. I assume your people have their own traditions about what women can and can't do. We do, Hotar admitted. Though perhaps not as restrictive as you might think. Women in our band hold significant power in certain areas. They make decisions about the home, about children's education, about resource distribution within families. The Council of Grandmothers has veto power over certain decisions the chief makes. My own mother was one of the strongest voices in our community before she died, and my father relied on her counsel more than he relied on any of his warriors. Your mother is dead, Thea asked softly. 5 years now, Hotar said, and she could hear the grief still present in his voice. Fever took her one winter. We had medicine, had healing herbs and ceremonies, but nothing worked. She just got weaker and weaker until one morning she didn't wake up. My father was devastated. They'd been married for 30 years, had known each other since childhood. Part of him died with her, I think. He's still a good chief, still makes wise decisions, but the joy went out of him that winter and never really came back. I'm sorry, Thea said, and meant it. She understood that kind of loss, the way it could hollow you out and change the fundamental shape of who you were. My mother died when I was young, 9 years old. Fever too, though it happened fast. One day she was fine, the next she was burning up, and 3 days later she was gone. My father never remarried. I think he loved her too much to even consider it. He just poured all his energy into me and the business, trying to fill the hole she left behind. They sat with that shared understanding of loss for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Then Hotar shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. How are you managing this, he asked. Truly, you're stuck in a cabin with a stranger who's brought nothing but trouble into your life. You're missing deliveries, losing money, risking your reputation, and possibly your safety. Most people would be furious or resentful. But you seem almost calm about it. Thea considered his question carefully. I think I'm too tired to be furious, she said finally. And resentment doesn't help anyone. Yes, this is costing me. Yes, there will be consequences when I finally make it back to civilization and have to explain where I've been and why I missed my contracts. But I made a choice, and I have to live with it. Spending energy on anger or regret won't change anything, so I might as well focus on what I can control, which is keeping us both alive until you're healed enough to travel. You're a remarkable woman, Hotar said quietly. I'm a practical woman, Thea corrected. There's a difference. Remarkable suggests something special or unique. I'm just someone doing what needs to be done because nobody else is here to do it. Before Hotar could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but unmistakable. Voices, men's voices, speaking in low tones, and they were getting closer. Thea was on her feet instantly, her rifle in her hands, before she'd even consciously decided to grab it. She moved to the window, carefully peeling back a corner of the canvas she'd nailed over it to peer outside. Her heart was hammering in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system. Through the narrow gap she could see them, 3 men on horseback, picking their way carefully through the deep snow. They were maybe 100 yards away, moving slowly, their heads turning as they scanned the area. How many? Hotar whispered from behind her. He'd managed to sit up despite the pain, and she could see he'd grabbed a piece of firewood as an improvised weapon. 3, Thea whispered back. On horses. They're searching for something. For me, Hotar said grimly. They've come to confirm the kill or finish what they started. Thea, you need to hide me. If they find me here with you, they'll kill us both to cover their tracks. Thea's mind raced. The cabin was tiny, with nowhere to really hide someone. The only option was the small root cellar her father had mentioned once, accessed through a trapdoor in the floor near the back corner. She'd noticed it yesterday but hadn't investigated, hadn't thought she'd need to. "There's a cellar," she said quickly. "Can you move?" "I'll have to," Hotar said, already pushing himself up with visible effort. Thea slung her rifle over her shoulder and moved to help him, taking most of his weight as they stumbled toward the back of the cabin. She kicked aside some debris and found the trapdoor, pulling it open to reveal a dark space below. It smelled of earth and old potatoes, but it was big enough for a person to fit. Getting Hotar down into the cellar was brutal. Every movement caused him pain, and twice he nearly passed out, his weight becoming completely dead in her arms. But somehow they managed it, and he collapsed on the dirt floor below, breathing hard. "Your bandages," Thea hissed. "They're showing blood." "Fresh blood. You've torn something. Deal with it later," Hotar gasped. "Close the door. If they kill you, wait until night and then run. Get back to your people and forget you ever saw me." "Shut up," Thea said shortly, and dropped the trapdoor closed. She kicked debris back over it, trying to make it look undisturbed, then grabbed her rifle and moved to the door. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She'd dealt with dangerous men before, miners who got too drunk and aggressive, drifters who thought a woman alone was easy prey. She knew how to handle herself, knew how to project confidence, even when she was terrified. The knock came just as she reached the door. 3 sharp raps, hard enough to shake the rickety frame. "Hello in there," a man's voice called. "This is Marshall Territory business." "Open up." Thea took a breath, settled her rifle into a casual but ready position, and opened the door. 3 men stood in the snow outside, and they looked exactly like what Hotar had described. Rough clothes that suggested trappers or prospectors, but eyes that were too sharp, movements that were too controlled. The one who'd knocked was tall, with a scarred face and a badge pinned to his coat that looked official, but probably wasn't. The other 2 flanked him, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Help you, gentlemen?" Thea asked, keeping her voice steady and slightly annoyed, like they'd interrupted something important. "Ma'am," the tall one said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that was probably meant to be respectful, but came off as mocking. "Name's Cutler. These are my associates, Doan and Pike. We're tracking a dangerous Indian who attacked a survey crew 2 days back. Killed 2 men before he ran off into the storm. You seen anyone matching that description?" It was a lie, of course. A clumsy one too, given that Hotar had been the one attacked, not the attacker. But these men were counting on her either not knowing the truth or being too scared to question their story. "I haven't seen anyone," Thea said flatly. "Been holed up here since the storm hit. Haven't been outside except to tend my horses. You can see my wagon over there, half buried. Not exactly in a position to notice anyone passing by." Cutler's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we take a look inside? Just to be thorough. This Indian's dangerous, killed men with a knife before taking off. We need to make sure every shelter in the area is checked." "I do mind, actually," Thea said, her voice hardening. "This is private property and you're not real marshals. I know what a territorial marshal's badge looks like, and that tin star you're wearing isn't it. So unless you've got a warrant or actual legal authority, you can get off this property and continue your search elsewhere." The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. The 2 men flanking Cutler shifted, their hands moving closer to their guns. Cutler himself smiled, but it was a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's not very neighborly, ma'am. Here we are, trying to keep people safe from a murderer, and you're being difficult. Makes a man wonder if maybe you've got something to hide." Thea levered around into her rifle's chamber, the metallic sound loud and unmistakable. "What I've got is a right to privacy and a very low tolerance for men who think they can bully a woman living alone. You want to search this cabin, you go get a real marshal and a real warrant. Until then, you're trespassing, and I'm within my rights to defend my property. Now I'll ask you one more time, politely. Leave." For a long moment nobody moved. Thea could see Cutler calculating, weighing his options. He had 2 men with him, and they were all armed. She was alone, with a rifle that held, 15 rounds if she'd loaded it full this morning, which she had. In a straight fight, the odds weren't great, but they were in the open, and she had cover from the cabin. And more importantly, they didn't know for certain that Hotar was inside. If they forced the issue, and it turned out she was just a stubborn supply runner protecting her privacy, they'd have assaulted or killed a white woman for nothing, which would bring real law enforcement down on them. "Your name, ma'am?" Cutler asked, his tone deceptively mild. "Thea Lockhart. My father was James Lockhart, who some of you older trappers might remember. Built a reputation in this territory for fair dealing and not taking crap from anyone. I inherited both the business and the attitude. Now you've got your answer about whether I've seen your supposed Indian murderer, which is no. You've got my name, so you can report back to whoever's paying you that you checked this location. And you've overstayed your welcome. Leave now." Cutler stared at her for another few heartbeats, then shrugged. "Suit yourself, Miss Lockhart. But if that Indian does show up, if you see any sign of him, you'd be wise to report it immediately. For your own safety, you understand. These are dangerous times, and a woman alone in the wilderness, well, accidents happen. It was a threat, barely veiled, and they both knew it." "I'll keep that in mind," Thea said coldly. "Now get off my property before I decide you're a threat to my safety and act accordingly." The 3 men mounted their horses, Cutler taking his time, making it clear he was leaving by choice rather than because she'd intimidated him. As they rode away, picking their way back through the snow in the direction they'd come, Thea kept her rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did she allow herself to lower the weapon, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She closed the door, barred it with the piece of furniture she'd used before, and moved quickly to the trapdoor. "Hota," she called softly, pulling it open. "They're gone." For now, the silence that greeted her made her heart skip. "Hota," she said more urgently, grabbing a candle and lowering herself partway into the cellar. In the flickering light, she could see him slumped against the earthen wall, unconscious. And there was blood, too much blood, soaking through the bandages around his torso. "No, no, no," Thea muttered, setting the candle down and reaching for him. He was still breathing, but it was shallow and rapid. The exertion of getting down into the cellar had torn open the stitches she'd worked so hard to place. "You stubborn fool. I told you not to move too much." Getting him back up out of the cellar and onto his bedroll was a nightmare, made worse by the fact that he was dead weight and bleeding actively. By the time she had him positioned by the fire again, she was covered in his blood and shaking with a combination of fear and exhaustion. She cut away the ruined bandages with her knife, revealing the damage. At least 3 of the stitches had torn completely, and several others were stretched and stressed. The wound was weeping blood and clear fluid, and the skin around it looked angry and inflamed. "You're going to survive this," Thea told him as she worked, cleaning the wound again with precious whiskey, preparing her needle and thread for a second round of stitching. "You hear me, Hota? You're going to survive because I didn't just risk my life lying to 3 murderers so you could bleed out from torn stitches. Now hold still and try not to die while I fix this mess you've made." He didn't respond, lost somewhere in unconsciousness or blood loss, or both. But his heart was still beating. She could see the pulse jumping in his neck, and that meant there was still hope. Thea bent to her work, her hands steady now despite everything, and began repairing the damage. Outside, the sun was starting to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. Inside the cabin, 2 people from different worlds fought their separate battles. One against men who wanted him dead, and one against the injuries trying to claim him, both refusing to give up despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. The 3rd morning brought fever, and with it, the real fight for Hotar's life began. Thea had stayed awake through most of the night, keeping watch over him after restitching his wounds. She dozed in fits and starts, jerking awake every time he moved or made a sound, terrified that he'd torn the stitches again or that infection had set in despite her best efforts. Around 3 in the morning, she'd reached out to check on him and felt the heat radiating from his skin even before she touched him. His forehead was burning, and when she pressed her hand against his chest, she could feel his heart racing like a panicked bird. Infection. The thing she'd been dreading since the moment she'd first seen his wounds. Out here, with limited supplies and no access to a real doctor, infection was often a death sentence. She'd seen men die from wounds far less severe than Hotar's, watched as fever consumed them from the inside out until there was nothing left but a husk. Her father had been one of them, though his infection had come from the sickness in his lungs rather than a wound. The memory of those final days, watching him burn up with fever while she could do nothing but wipe his forehead with cool water and pray, still haunted her. But she wasn't that helpless girl anymore. She was a woman who'd learned hard lessons about survival and stubbornness. She had supplies, had knowledge passed down from her mother and added to by years of frontier living. And she had something else too, a burning determination that refused to accept defeat. She hadn't dragged this man through a blizzard, hadn't stitched him back together twice, hadn't lied to killers to protect him, just to lose him to fever now. Thea spent the next hours in constant motion. She stripped away the blankets covering Hotar, knowing that despite the cabin's chill, she needed to bring his fever down before it cooked his brain. She made cold compresses from snow melted in her cooking pot, changing them every few minutes as they heated against his skin. She brewed willow bark tea, one of her mother's old remedies, and managed to get some down his throat even though he was barely conscious. She checked and rechecked his wounds, looking for signs of the angry red streaks that would indicate blood poisoning spreading through his system. Hotar drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the day, sometimes lucid enough to recognize her, other times lost in fever dreams, where he spoke in his own language, words Thea couldn't understand, but that sounded like prayers or warnings. Once he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes wild and unfocused, and said something that sounded like a name. She gently pried his fingers loose and soothed him back down, speaking softly, even though she doubted he could understand her in his current state. By evening, the fever had peaked. His temperature was so high that Thea could feel the heat from inches away, and she'd become genuinely frightened that he might not survive the night. She'd gone through her entire medical bag, used every remedy she knew, and still the fever raged. In desperation, she'd done something her mother had told her about, but she'd never tried. She'd packed snow directly against his torso and the major blood vessels in his neck and groin, trying to cool his core temperature before his organs started failing. It was a risk. The shock of the cold could kill him as surely as the fever. But doing nothing would definitely kill him, so she'd taken the gamble. For 20 terrifying minutes, she'd held the snow in place while Hotar's body shook with violent shivers, his teeth chattering so hard she worried he'd crack them. Then gradually the shaking had subsided. His breathing had evened out, and when she'd checked his temperature again with her hand against his forehead, she'd felt the difference. Still hot, but not that terrifying brain-cooking heat. The fever had broken. Thea had slumped back against the wall, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Her hands were raw from the cold and from wringing out compresses. Her back ached from bending over Hotar for hours. Her eyes burned with exhaustion and unshed tears. But he was alive. Still sick, still weak, but alive. The crisis had passed. She must have fallen asleep there against the wall, because the next thing she knew, pale morning light was filtering into the cabin, and someone was calling her name. Thea Lockhart, wake up! Her eyes snapped open to find Hotar looking at her, his gaze clear and focused for the first time in over a day. He was pale and obviously weak, but the fever flush was gone from his cheeks, and his eyes weren't glazed with delirium. "You're awake," she said, her voice hoarse. "How do you feel?" "Like death warmed over," Hotar admitted. "But alive, which I gather is more than I should be. What happened? I remember the men coming, hiding in the cellar, and then nothing until fever dreams that made no sense." Thea pushed herself to her feet, every joint protesting, and moved to check his wounds. "You tore your stitches getting into the cellar. Lost blood, and infection set in despite everything I'd done to prevent it. You've been fighting fever for almost 24 hours. I wasn't sure you were going to make it." She carefully lifted the bandages, relieved to see that while the skin around the wounds was still red and irritated, the angry inflammation had started to recede. The stitches were holding, and there was no fresh blood or the yellowish discharge that would indicate ongoing infection. "You saved my life," Hotar said quietly. "Again, I'm beginning to lose count of how many times. 3 times by my reckoning," Thea said, managing a tired smile. "Finding you in the snow, stitching you up and keeping you alive through the fever. You're getting expensive, you know. I'm running low on medical supplies, and I've used up most of my whiskey on sterilizing wounds, instead of drinking it, which is a real tragedy." Despite his obvious pain and weakness, Hotar laughed, a sound that turned into a cough that made him wince. "I'll make sure my father compensates you for your losses, though I'm not sure there's enough payment in the world to cover what you've done." "I don't want payment," Thea said, more sharply than she'd intended. "I didn't do this for money or reward. I did it because it was right, because you needed help, and I was there to give it. Don't cheapen it by trying to turn it into a transaction." Hotar studied her face for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or respect. "You're right. I apologize. What you've done, what you've risked, that's not something that can be repaid with gold or goods. It's a debt of honor, of life itself. My people have strong traditions around such debts. You've given me my life 3 times over, and that creates bonds that don't break easily." They lapsed into silence, but it was a comfortable one now. The silence of 2 people who'd been through something profound together. Thea prepared food, a thin soup made from the last of her dried vegetables and some jerky. It wasn't much, but it was warm and nourishing, and Hotar managed to eat most of his portion without difficulty. The fact that he could keep food down was another good sign. "Those men who came," Hotar said after they'd finished eating, "the ones you called Cutler and his associates. You took a huge risk lying to them. If they'd forced their way in and found me, they would have killed you without hesitation." "Why did you do it?" "I would have blamed myself if I hadn't," Thea said simply. "And I told you before, I'm not in the habit of letting people die just to make my own life easier. Besides, those men were killers. They came here hunting you like an animal, planning to murder you and probably lie about it afterwards. I wasn't going to be part of it. They'll be back," Hotar warned. "Maybe not those same men, but others like them. Once word spreads that I survived, that someone helped me, they'll come looking. And they'll figure out eventually that it was you." "Then let them come," Thea said with more confidence than she felt. "I've got my rifle and I know how to use it. And I've got the truth on my side. I saved a man who was dying. That's not a crime, no matter how some people might try to spin it. The truth doesn't always protect people," Hotar said, and there was a weight of experience in his words. "But I admire your courage, and I promise you this, if anyone does come after you because of me, my people will stand with you. You'll have the protection of the Many Horses Band, which is not something offered lightly to outsiders." The next 2 days passed in a strange routine that felt almost normal despite the abnormal circumstances. Hotar's strength returned gradually, and by the 2nd day he could stand on his own and walk across the cabin without assistance, though any sudden movement still caused him obvious pain. They talked during those days, long conversations that ranged from profound to mundane. Hotar told her stories about growing up in the band, about the traditions that governed his people's lives, about the pressure of being the chief's only son. Thea shared her own stories in return, about learning the business from her father, about the loneliness of running it alone, about her modest dreams for the future. On the morning of the 5th day since Thea had found Hotar in the snow, they prepared to leave. Thea had spent the previous evening loading the wagon with her remaining supplies and rigging a makeshift seat in the back, where Hotar could ride with some support for his injured torso. She'd fashioned a sling for his arm to take pressure off his ribs, and she'd made him promise that he'd tell her immediately if the pain became too severe. The morning was cold but clear, with no sign of another storm threatening. Thea hitched brandy and whiskey to the wagon, both horses seeming eager to finally be moving after days of confinement. She helped Hotar into his seat in the back, arranging blankets and furs around him to keep him warm during the journey. "Ready?" she asked, climbing into the driver's seat and taking up the reins. "As I'll ever be," Hotar replied. "Thea, before we go, I need to say something." "Thank you. You saved my life when you had every reason not to. You risked everything for a stranger. That kind of courage is rare, and I won't forget it. Whatever happens after this, know that you have a friend and an ally in me and in my people. Always." Thea felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You're welcome," she said simply. "Now let's get you home before your father sends out a search party." The journey was slow and difficult. The snow had settled some, but it was still deep enough in places that the wagon wheels struggled. They followed Hotar's directions, heading north through the valley where the going was marginally easier. The landscape was breathtaking in its winter severity, all sharp edges and pure whites, interrupted only by the dark lines of trees. Around midday, they reached the point where the trail turned east. Hotar called for a stop and pointed toward a ridge in the distance. "That's the southern boundary of our winter territory," he said. "We're getting close now. Another hour, maybe two, and we'll start encountering scouts from my people. When we do, let me do the talking. They'll be suspicious of a white woman driving a wagon into our camp." They continued on, and soon Thea spotted the first scout on a ridge. Even from a distance, she could see the moment he spotted them, the way he wheeled his horse around and disappeared. "He's going back to alert the others," Hotar said. "Keep driving and stay calm no matter what happens." 5 minutes later, 4 riders appeared ahead of them, blocking the trail. They were all warriors, armed and watchful. As Thea drew the wagon to a halt, one of them rode forward, his eyes moving from her to Hotar. Recognition flashed across his face, followed immediately by shock and then a rapid exchange in their language. Hotar responded at length, his voice calm but firm. The exchange went on for several minutes, voices rising in what sounded like argument. Finally, Hotar raised his hand for silence and switched to English. "This woman, Thea Lockhart, found me dying in the snow after the ambush. She risked her own life to save mine, and now brings me home. She is to be treated with the highest respect. Anyone who threatens her will answer to me and to my father. Is this understood?" The lead warrior stared at Hotar, then at Thea. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear. Finally, he nodded once and spoke in accented English. "Understood. We escort you to camp. Chief will want to see you both immediately." The warriors formed up around the wagon, and they moved forward as a group, cresting a rise before descending into a sheltered valley where the winter camp spread out below. It was larger than she'd expected, maybe 40 or 50 structures. As they descended, people began to notice their arrival. Thea could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching her, could hear the murmurs spreading through the crowd. They were led to the largest structure in the camp, and moments later, a man emerged. Thea knew immediately this was Hotar's father. The resemblance was striking. Chief Apata's eyes went first to his son, and she saw relief flash across his features. Then his gaze moved to her, assessing. "You are the woman who saved my son," he said in clear English. "I am," Thea said, climbing down from the wagon. "Thea Lockhart, sir. I found him in the snow during the blizzard. He was badly injured, so I did what I could to help." Chief Apata studied her, then did something unexpected. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. "Then you have given me back the thing I treasure most in this world," he said quietly. "And for that, you will always have the gratitude and protection of the many horses people. You are welcome in our camp, now and always. You have made yourself family through your actions, and family is sacred to us." As warriors helped Hotar down from the wagon and the chief moved to embrace his son, Thea stood slightly apart, watching the reunion. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, about the choice she'd made in the snow that had changed everything. She didn't know what consequences awaited her when she returned to her own world. But standing here, watching a father reunited with his son, seeing the gratitude in the eyes of people who had every reason to distrust outsiders, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Sometimes being brave wasn't about grand gestures. Sometimes it was just about seeing someone who needed help and choosing to extend your hand, regardless of the cost. And in that moment, despite everything she'd been through and everything that might still come, Thea Lockhart felt at peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.